Welcome to Exploration Radio, Mark. You are our first repeat guest, so hopefully it means something.
Hopefully good.
Yeah, that's So we already did a episode with you where we talked about a little bit about your career and where you ended up. Today we have a little bit of a different tack that we want to talk about. So one of the requests that we get almost unanimously from a lot of our listeners is to talk about how someone goes through the process of starting a company, especially a junior explorer. And what we wanted to do was to talk to a few people that have gone through that process and see what lessons they've learned, what mistakes they would want to avoid next time around, and what advice would they give to people that are going down this path. So that's kind of the topic that we want to talk to you about today.
Sure.
Hi, my name is Ahmad.
Hi, my name's Steve, and this is Exploration Radio, a podcast focused on the past, present, and future of exploration.
So we didn't actually cover this in our previous interview. Do you want to give a little quick intro into yourself and your background about where you've been, what you've done?
Yeah, I'll keep it brief. Basically, started off studying geology because I like rocks. No other reason than that. Got into exploration because I sort of fancied chasing the treasures of the earth. Being a POM and in the UK, that wasn't really the place to do it. So after a long journey, ended up in Australia a long time ago as a geologist working for Western Mining Corporation, which was great, but then gradually ended up sort of drifting down the food chain into smaller and smaller companies and ending up where I am now, which is great, but you sort of do less geology, you're more of everything else, but you're able to influence the outcome a bit more.
So the later part of your career has been mostly in junior exploration companies. Did you have a desire to go down this route, or did you pick opportunities that just came up as you went along?
It was just a sort of evolutionary process, really. I didn't start my career with a particular plan in mind, or really a clear picture of the structure of the industry and how it all ticks. So it's not like I started that way. I started off just being glad to be getting paid for doing what I loved. And, as you live and learn, you get exposed to more things and you learn more. In a big company, you come up against a few barriers that sort of impede you on the way. And you can either sit back and cruise or try and shake the tree a bit yourself and do something yourself, which is what I ended up doing.
So the desire to go and run your own companies is really just so you could be the architect of your own success and demise in some ways?
Yeah, very much so. As a geologist in a big company, you can do a lot of good work and it might have a material consequence. Or you could be slaving away for years and years doing the same thing and never see any outcome for what you do. And if I think you're motivated and passionate about what you do, that very soon becomes not the thing, and you want to actually be able to see a consequence for your actions.
So let's explore that for a little bit. So if you're someone that has a little bit more of an entrepreneurial background, do you think you have a limited shelf life in most companies or bigger companies?
I think, the bigger the company, by necessity, the more structure, the more layers, the more process, the more rigor. So if that's what you're comfortable with, that's fine. But if you are of more of an entrepreneurial sort of bent, then I think over time you can become frustrated, and it takes a while for that level of frustration to sort of overcome the inertia and the fear of actually cutting loose, but eventually, yes.
So the frustration that you're talking about, is that more from a technical point or a non-technical point? What's the root cause of that?
I don't think from a technical point. The best part of 10 years I spent with WMC was great, and I learned so much. Mm-hmm. And that was a very necessary step on my sort of journey. But it's being able to deploy your ideas and test them. There's more competition, so it's harder to get oxygen in a bigger company. And a lot of new HR people would probably protest at this, but I think, there's greater downside to sticking your head up and taking a risk, because you're more likely to get a negative outcome from doing that than not. So most people, I think, would rather sort of not take that sort of risk, and it's very much dependent on character and just your general approach to life. I think your degree of tolerance of risk taking, whether you're prepared to do that or not. And I know lots of great geologists who are perfectly content to do their thing in big companies and very happy doing it. And I know lots of people who aren't necessarily such great geologists, but who want to shake the tree a bit more and see if they can not necessarily benefit financially from what they do, but just actually see a consequence for what they do.
Ah, okay. So in your case, the motivation to leave a company wasn't so much that, like in big companies, no matter how hard you work, you kind of get paid a salary, really. So in your case, it wasn't that motivation of the financial gain. So it was more that you wanted to satisfy your rage against the machine kind of aspect?
Yes, yeah. And I think it's actually, the opposite. To leave a bigger company in a salaried position, to go to a smaller company where there's a lot more risk, a lot less certainty. You'll probably get paid less. You'll probably, if you're sensible, have more options and so on, so you leverage to the upside. But in general, there isn't any upside. So chances are you're going to end up worse off. And if you're in a position where you can't afford to be worse off, then that's a very difficult step to take. I wouldn't go from a big company and try and start a small one for a financial benefit. You have to do it because you have the passion for it, because in exploration particularly, you fail most of the time. You're not going to get a good financial outcome most of the time. You've got to be doing it because you love it. And that's what will keep you doing it long enough to give yourself a chance to hit the jackpot one day.
So do you consider yourself as a managing director of a junior explorer? Do you consider yourself an entrepreneur in some ways?
Not really. I consider someone like Elon Musk an entrepreneur. I'm just somebody who does what he does because he doesn't know what else to do.
Yeah, okay. I guess the reason I asked the entrepreneur question is I came across this thing which I quite like, that entrepreneurs will work 80 hours a week for themselves to avoid working 40 hours a week for someone else. Clearly, the why in that equation is very important.
Yeah, I guess, in that sense, I guess that you would call me an entrepreneur, although it sounds a lot grander than it actually is. But everybody running their own business is really an entrepreneur. The sole sort of beneficiaries of it, and it lives or dies on what they do. So they put the effort in.
So let's go back to the moment where you left WMC. How did you pick your next set of roles? Did you have an aim to get a certain type of role when you left WMC?
Leaving WMC, I'd become a bit frustrated with the bureaucracy and inertia of a big company and some of the hypocrisy that was inherent in it. And pretty well almost as an impulse decided, right, I'm going to just leave WMC. I'm going to go and get a job with a small company, which involved moving cities, moving states, going from what appeared to be a secure salaried position to a very insecure position. And I didn't think about it too much. I think, if you take the time to overanalyze those things, you'll always find plenty of reasons not to do it. So sometimes it's just good to jump.
Yep. Yeah, that's right.
And a lot of things I think that get called gut feel or instinctive are actually very sensible, thought out things. They're just not that well organized in your head to be able to rationally explain it to somebody else. But when the time's right for something, it's right.
So leaving WMC, there was a certain time period before you finally came around to running a company where you were a director of a company. What were the steps in between that you had to take to get there?
Well, in between, I moved to what was a small company that was in the process of being taken over by a Canadian company called Lion Ore, and that space of a few years went from a $40 million company to a $7 billion company, largely because of the discoveries that we made. And that was a great time as well, and an important time, because that was a company that was small enough that, at the start at least, that you could do things and make a difference. And we did, and we made discoveries and added value to the company, which ultimately led to its demise. A successful demise, but a demise nonetheless. So that was a sort of intermediate stage in between big company and microcap that sort of gave myself and other people the chance, enough time and money to do something meaningful, to make discoveries. And discoveries that had a material impact on the company.
Mm-hmm.
But it was also, I think, the disparity between the impact that those discoveries had on the company and the extent to that they had an impact on me that sort of led to me making the next decision about doing it properly for myself.
Okay. So you kind of learned the toolkit at that time, and then you could then transfer that to a smaller company, essentially.
Yeah, I learnt the toolkit, and it was great and really rewarding as a geologist, making discoveries and being involved in everything that follows on from that and getting recognition for it internally and externally as well. But the key thing, I think, in one of those discoveries was a bittersweet sort of moment when it was the Waterloo nickel mine, and two major shareholders of our joint venture partners, we'd probably made them $50 million overnight, and they were in the courtyard hugging and dancing, which was great for them. And I was really happy. But simultaneously, you're thinking, oh, great, well, I'm going to get a bottle of wine for this. Do I want to keep on doing this?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think that's probably a thing that motivates a lot of people. When you directly see the people that are benefiting from your labor, you want to translate your labor into the most effective means that you can as well.
Yeah, and it's not something you don't wish on them, but spreading the love a bit.
Yeah, you want to be part of it, right? Like it's not about being exclusive; it's about being inclusive. Try to include as many people as you can in that process.
Yeah.
So now, becoming a director of a company obviously involves a lot of other things like legal responsibilities, financial responsibilities. How did you gain that knowledge?
I didn't have any formal sort of professional development or training on that front. It was pretty well all learnt on the job, and my first position as a director was in a company that was pretty challenging and not very pleasant at all, but set me up with the whole range of experiences of fighting in the trenches and knowing what not to do as well as what to do in future. That was a sort of vital part of the next sort of chapter, if you like. So no formal training. A lot of what goes on in the boardroom is the same as anywhere else. There's a lot of common sense involved, but there's also a lot of statutory responsibilities to be aware of, much more complex than you first imagine, I think. And in terms of making decisions, a lot of decisions have pros and cons to them, and there's a very big grey area in decision making. So often the decision you make at a board level, there isn't an easy, obvious answer to, and the consequence can be quite significant if you make the wrong decision.
That's high.
So I think you need a certain ability to live with that degree of uncertainty and risk if you're going to be a director. That's not to say you want to be swashbuckling and a cowboy, far from it. But if you jumped at every sort of shadow that is presented to you as a director, you would be frozen. You wouldn't be able to make a decision.
So did you get mentoring during this phase of your career?
No, absolutely no mentoring, absolutely no formal sort of professional development, but lots and lots of on-the-job training every day, every minute, being confronted with situations, decisions to make. And there's only so much you can learn about it. I think, as with a lot of things, your role as a director on a board is very much dependent on the dynamics and relationships with the other directors.
Okay.
And, you can have a charismatic guy in charge. You can have people being fully transparent to the board or not, as the case may be. You can have people with vested interests or alliances or fears that lead to all sorts of behaviours, and learning those and being aware of them and working your way around them is a large part of it, as it is in lots of situations, So you can have a very good board that's well credentialed but completely dysfunctional, or you can have a bunch of first timers who just get it and work well together. What you don't want is a guy who's very very charismatic and glib, and a bunch of people who are just prepared to take things on face value. You need people who are different, who are prepared to question one another and bang the table every now and again as well, just so that everybody is fully accountable.
So healthy tension is a good thing in these type of environments?
Oh yeah, absolutely. If you've got everybody thinking the same thing, you're setting yourself up for a fall sooner or later.
So during this time, did you ever feel that you were not well suited to being a director? Did you ever feel doubt about the role that you were doing?
I didn't feel not well suited to being a director. I certainly felt not well suited to being a director in that particular company, given some of the other personalities and things going on. But
so how did you choose your first company?
It chose me rather than me choosing it. There was a circumstance at the end of Lion Ore where some of the people involved in that were going to go and find a shell, set themselves up, and repeat it all over again. And I got tapped on the shoulder to ask if I wanted to be the technical director for that company, if you like. Mm-hmm. So I saw that as an opportunity, albeit with with a price to pay that came with it, and probably ended up a lot poorer, but a lot wiser after 3 years of that.
Okay. The first company that you were part of was Apex Minerals. Yep. Which in your words from our last episode was a corporate disaster.
Yep.
So you just mentioned that there was a cost to you personally there. Do you mind elaborating a little bit more about what that was?
Yeah, sure. When things don't go well, that's when you start dwelling on the potential personal risk and downside. And even if, in an overt sense, you can deal with that at a gut level, that can sort of build up and have an effect. So I had very interesting few years on that board. There were a couple of key things about that. One example is, at the start of Apex, I was issued with some options, which was great. The problem being, particularly with the way the ATO changes tax law all the time, is by the time I was issued those options, the share price had run and they were technically in the money. And the ATO deemed that I'd made a profit, even though, firstly, I hadn't exercised the options, and secondly, I couldn't for 2 years.
Yeah, that's all right. So you get dinged for like fringe benefit or something like that.
Yeah, well, just a paper profit on these things. So, and the magnitude of that was such that I essentially had to sell everything I owned to pay the tax department. And for the next couple of years, the company sort of deteriorated. And by the time the options had actually vested, they were worthless. So I had nothing to actually cash in to compensate for this notional paper profit that I'd made. So that was a pretty good learning experience. And at the start of Sirius, after Apex, I was virtually penniless because of that. But probably a good example of the sort of thing that you need to be aware of as some of the downside of being a director is partway through that company, we got into a bit of a dispute with another company about a commercial arrangement, and the other company took the view that we'd not honoured our part of the agreement. So one day there was a knock on the door, and this guy presented me with a brown envelope, which I opened, and it was me being sued by another company for several $1 million. My wife was standing behind me at the time and just asked what it was in the post, and I just said, "Oh, nothing." And you're standing there realising that the only thing that you've got left, which is the roof above your head, might not be there anymore, and you've got other people sort of relying on you for that, and that's when you really get tested, I think.
So those stories are a great example of the potential downside of when things don't go so well. Was there also damage to you as an individual, like your reputation in the industry?
Oh, look, absolutely. I mean, in the latter days of that adventure, there were a number of shareholders who'd been in at the start who all ended up losing a lot of money, individuals and big institutions. And they were, to say unhappy is a bit of an understatement. They don't distinguish between, Mr. A or Mrs. B on the board. It's just the board, so you all get tarred with the same brush. At the start of Sirius, I was very much tarred with that reputation, and there was a lot of passive sort of obstructive behaviour that basically, knocking on a lot of doors that didn't get opened. And probably one story that sticks in my mind actually is I went over to Vancouver to meet a fund manager based over there who'd been an investor in Apex, and it was sort of said with a bit of humour, but there was an edge to it as well, because we'd arranged a meeting, and then when I got there, I got to reception, and the reception called my name through to him, and I heard him. He sort of shouted out, "Quick, call security!" So, he sort of understood that what had happened was not necessarily my fault, but I was still part of that organisation, and you have to sort of overcome those perceptions. And it probably took 18 months to 2 years to actually recover my reputation from that.
Because even when you started Sirius, one of your obviously main partners was Mark Creasy, who was also involved in Apex Minerals as well.
Yeah.
So, in a small industry like this, the degrees of separation aren't that many, where your reputation can actually prevent a lot of things from happening as well.
That's right. I think in that instance, it sort of worked the reverse way, because Mark was close enough to what was going on to get that it wasn't necessarily to be the blame to be laid at my doorstep. So he was prepared to back me again, which was good. Whereas somebody who was more distant from it wouldn't be able to discern one from the other.
So after Apex, what convinced you to get back into that cage, into that ring?
It was really the way Sirius came together. It was in part a way of getting out of Apex. Mm-hmm. In part because I was going to be the MD this time.
Yep.
That I would have the chance to set the rules and do things the way I felt should be done, rather than somebody else's way. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the lessons from Apex that were about the negative behaviours and how not to do things, I made sure the sort of culture of Sirius was based around the exact opposite of that, how you should do things and what not to do.
So did you have a lot more say in how the board came together in Sirius?
Yeah, it was a very unusual situation. I wasn't an MD recruited by a board. I was essentially put in as an MD of a blank canvas and almost recruited the board myself, which meant that I could have some influence over the sort of culture of that board. I think if you're an MD or a CEO coming into a position that is governed by an incumbent board, you're very much held to the culture of that existing board, and it's very difficult for you to be able to implant your own culture into it. So if there's a mismatch, it doesn't have a happy ending. Whereas I was fortunate that I was the one sort of calling the shots in a way, and I could make sure that there was much more of a match of cultures to suit what I was trying to achieve this time round.
Mm-hmm. So now there is a perception in the industry that Mark is a tough customer to deal with. Did you find that when you started dealing with him?
Depends what you mean by tough. Tough in the sense that he doesn't suffer fools, which is fine.
Yep.
Tough in the sense that he's very shrewd. He thinks strategically and long term, which can frustrate people who've got a shorter term agenda. Mm-hmm. And I think tough in that, he will take his own time to make his mind up, which is fine. He's not short of opportunities or people coming to him with suggestions as to how he should spend his money. Mm-hmm. So you're bound to be a bit hard-nosed, I think, in that circumstance.
Yep.
If there's trust and respect there, he's fine. He's one of the people I really admire in the industry, actually, because he just follows his own path, doesn't worry about everybody else, and is pretty good at what he does.
Yeah, I think the track record speaks for itself in that sense.
Yeah, no, he's a pretty unique sort of guy. He's not in need of money tomorrow to pay the gas bill, so you can afford to be a bit more strategic and long term.
So would Sirius have happened if Apex hadn't?
Probably not, because that's how I got to know Mark in the first place. Apart from needing to give some of his own private assets a good shake using somebody else's money in a public company, I think he was wanting to use that as a way of clawing back some of the money he'd lost in Apex as well. So all these things connect, I think. I don't think you can disconnect them. They're all consequences of what's gone before.
Yeah, sliding doors working out at the right moment. Yeah. Because I guess one of the things that we talked to you about previously was the fact that you did the deal with Mark to get the company up and running. And I think it's kind of important to know the backstory with Apex, because I think both of you probably would have been primed for that interaction through your connection at Apex. Not just the fact that you knew each other, but also the way the company went and then the opportunities that came out of Sirius. Yeah,
for sure. He saw the blood and guts, saw how people behaved and reacted, got to know people's strengths and weaknesses a bit more, and so all of that, I think, sort of made him more comfortable in putting some of his assets into my hands in that sense.
And I think even from your point, I mean, you just mentioned the fact that after Apex, you were in somewhat of a precarious situation. So I think the fact that you maybe didn't have as much to lose, you were probably more willing to give a little bit more on your next endeavor as well.
Well, that's an interesting sort of bit of psychology that I've seen in various circumstances. Is if you've got nothing to lose, you're more likely to give it a go because you've got nothing to lose.
Yeah, that's. It's all upside.
Yeah, it's all upside. If you have got things at risk, then you think harder about putting those things at risk, and maybe it influences your behaviour. And that was the case actually through Sirius post discovery of Nova. In the way we did things commercially, is we went about it because we felt we had nothing to lose, and we consciously maintained that mindset. We went through a lot of different sorts of commercial negotiations with a bit more boldness than we would have otherwise had. Which was a very interesting process, and that includes raising money on the equity markets. How we did that. It includes how we got the debt financing from the banks, and how we got our offtake agreements with some of the third parties as well. Rather than settle for $10 today, we were going for $100 next year.
So so let's talk about Sirius in that sense. Was there opposing views on the board on how you should do that?
Without going into too much detail, I think there was a minority element on the board that was suddenly starstruck with all of this paper wealth. And both when I say paper wealth, I mean the value of the company and the potential value of their options or shares in it, both aspects.
Which is not an uncommon thing.
It's not uncommon, you suddenly get stranded in the headlight and you think, you got this little pot of gold. I can't bear to lose it. Let's just grab it. And it's a lot harder to just hold your nerve and say, let's leave that on the line. Let's leave it on the table. Let's leave it at risk. And it might turn into 10 pots of gold, which is, the way it eventually panned out. But that's the time we were talking about boards earlier and different personalities and so on. And that's when people really show their cards.
Yeah. So, I mean, like that concept of what you really see the underbelly of the industry, because there seems to be this perception that, once you have a discovery, it's all smooth sailing from that point on. But in reality, from what you and I talked about in our previous interview, the reality is very different. I would probably say arguably it gets harder once you find something, because you have a lot more people circling around you now.
Yep, yeah. I'll mix my metaphors here. So that sort of cliche, it's a jungle out there, does exist for a reason. There's a lot of wild animals wanting to prey on you and take what you've got away from you. And the feeling I had post the discovery of Nova was it was such a quality discovery in such a sort of bare landscape at the time that everybody was looking and everybody was wanting. Mm-hmm. So you suddenly feel like you're on the savannah, you've got the only scrap of meat, and every bugger out there is circling and will dash in and grab it if you take your eyes off it or sleep for one moment. Yeah. And that's when I think the hard yards really start. It translates into just doing more things faster, like drilling it quicker, getting a resource, increasing it, staying a moving target so that nobody can get a fix on you. And that's when all sorts of predators come out, people who will offer you what seems like a great financing deal in return for an offtake, which can come back and bite you in the bum big time later on, or people offering to raise you money, which ultimately is for their benefit, not yours. And then, other corporates who want the asset, who will do everything they can, any way they can to try and get that asset, which may involve quietly talking to some of your bigger shareholders on the side to get a block of support, or it might involve out of the blue them writing you an offer that they deem is a material event, which forces you to disclose it to the market, which then makes it a self-fulfilling exercise almost. So, the classic...
They force your hand in some ways.
Classic bear hug.
Yeah.
And so you've got people doing all sorts of things like that all the time. And as a director, you're constantly saying, okay, what's best for the shareholders? What's not in the interest of shareholders? Is this something that I'm required to take seriously as a director on behalf of shareholders or not? Do I say anything about it or not? And that's when all of the regulatory things come into play and make it really hard as a director to know what the right thing to do is. Because, you could receive an informal offer from a third party about something and at the time be fully convinced it's a ridiculously lowball offer and do nothing about it. And then 3 months down the track, if something adverse has happened and the share price is lower and somehow this is disclosed, you'll be accused of not doing the right thing by the shareholders, even though based on what you had to play in front of you at the time, it was exactly the right thing to do. So you've got to try and weigh up all of these things, and it's a constant barrage. It's not like the occasional prod. It's non-stop.
Yeah, that's right. And there is a whole legal environment around it where you're not just talking about, a mistake going, something could happen. It could be jail. It could be financial ruin.
Class actions from shareholders. It can be ASIC investigations, you name it. And that guy who rocks up at the front door with the brown paper envelope might indeed end up with your house.
Jeez. So how do you prepare yourself for that circus that you have to go through?
I don't know if you can prepare yourself for it, because until you've experienced it, I don't think you can really fully appreciate what's coming. Mm-hmm. I think it's just a circumstance that is thrust upon people, and by chance or whatever, it just depends if you have the sort of attitude and the sort of intestinal fortitude to be able to take it or not. And some people can just roll with the punches. Some people just crumble under the weight of that sort of pressure. Some people even enjoy it. The people who in another life would be playing poker in Vegas or something, they actually enjoy the risk. And actually, I think it produces endorphins or something. They get off on it.
So which one are you in that?
I'm not that. I'm somewhere in the middle, I think.
Okay. So, this situation obviously sounds very stressful. Did it have any effect on you personally from like your personal health point of view?
I think, in the sort of bad days of Apex, it certainly had an effect on me. There was a time when I was admitted to hospital actually and had to actually have an angiogram because of the stress. Turns out that it was fine. They stuck a tube at my femoral artery. They sort of swabbed me all up, ready for open heart surgery, and I was lying on the slab watching this all on TV, conscious, which was fairly scary. But turns out that by them doing it, they found out that it was great. Open arteries, low cholesterol and everything. So that was a good sort of checkup. But at the time, it didn't feel that good. But then on the flip side to that coin is with Sirius, even though the stakes were much higher, it was all a big positive wave of good things. And even though that came with a lot of threats that you had to deal with, that you were dealing with those threats for positive reasons to sort of add value and improve things rather than to limit the downside. So that was very stressful too, but hey, you got to wish for that sort of stress. And, I spent 3 years living on caffeine, alcohol and adrenaline and not getting much sleep and doing 40 meetings in 5 countries in 5 days and things like that, which takes its toll physically, but was a heck of a ride. Now with S2, the clock's reset and we're back to being a small explorer again. And there's an expectation that, we'll just pull the next Nova out from the proverbial, and easier said than done. So you do feel the weight of expectation all over again. And you get a whole bunch of people out there in the market who have different motives and different tolerances. And so, some of those people are quite relaxed and are content to stay the journey. Other people get a bit irritated and you have to deal with them on a pretty regular basis. And that can get you down a bit. But that's what comes with the territory.
I mean, I find that really interesting that, success is not necessarily the end point either. It then builds up expectations for the next go that it would have been okay if you packed up and left and went and did something different. But now when you're still in the game, those expectations add a little bit of pressure on as well. Yeah,
they do. After Sirius, a lot of people assume that we'd just put our feet up and retire, and were surprised when we didn't and asked why. And the reason is because this is what we do and we love doing it. We always believe that there's going to be another one, and we're better positioned now to at least give it a good shake than we were before, thanks to the track record and everything that sort of springs from that. So we're not doing it for the love of it in a romantic way, which is just, to have a nice hike in the hills or something like that. We're doing it because we know what value it can deliver and how it can change people's lives as well. And we focus on the doing of it and the enjoyment of it, despite the downside, because if you enjoy it, you're going to do it well and you're going to give yourself a better chance of actually succeeding. Whereas if you just focused on what the end game is, which essentially is the money, you're less likely to be doing what you need to be doing in the here and now to actually get to that point.
Mm-hmm. So in that sense, success kind of buys you a little bit of loyalty from investors as well?
Yeah, it's very much a double-edged sword. It buys you the sort of profile to be able to do it and the loyalty from people to be able to do it, but it also brings that expectation as well.
Yeah.
And that stuff has a shelf life too. So, we're conscious that we want to do it again, and we've only got a certain amount of time to do it before.
Yeah, that's right. You're only as good as your last project exactly. In some ways. Yeah. So the process of finding Nova was obviously very rewarding. Were you slightly jaded by a lot of the other aspects of that process?
Yeah, there's it's a thankless job. You're everybody's hero when things are going well, but quite the opposite when things aren't going well. And they don't have to be bad for you to be...
it just has to be the perception of it trending bad or something like that, right?
The lack of good.
Yeah, that's right, yeah. Or the lack of great, perhaps. Yeah.
So, you do have to spend a lot of time having the same conversations with people and maintaining the belief, which is important and time well spent if it has a good outcome. But, there are a lot of people in there in the market who are only interested in a quick profit for themselves and are your best mates when things are going well, but will turn on you like vipers if things aren't going well.
you would have experienced it the opposite way.
Yes.
Yeah, like you would have obviously had a lot of people that had a certain reputation or concept about you, and then you would have had to do the opposite. So you would have had the venom first and then the gratitude later, probably.
Yeah, well, it was an instance at the start of Sirius after Apex where I'd organised an interview in Sydney with a broker and a fund manager, and got there at the appointed time. The secretary announced my arrival, and 2 hours later I was still sitting there. And I eventually went up and asked if this guy was going to turn up or not. She said, "Oh no, he's busy doing something else, sorry." And that was it. And that was, his way of making his point. So without being sort of confrontational about it, when it came time for one of the several capital raisings we did with Sirius to put a list together, that person wasn't on it.
What is it? Everyone gets their just desserts in the end. This is a really good example of you have to play fair with a lot of people because even on the way up, because you might meet them on the way down or vice versa as well. Yeah, absolutely. And the cards fell a much more adverse way for that person ultimately than they did for me. So, so do you enjoy this aspect?
No, I hate it. I hate it.
I don't think there's anyone that really.
I became a geologist because I was a bit of a loner and I like rocks and I didn't really like people, and rocks don't talk back. And I ended up in a job where I have to speak to people all the time.
I think, like having now obviously spoken to a few people, it's really interesting to me that that's like a common trait that people have to kind of learn as they go along, that you have to learn how to interact and deal with people. Yeah, without that, you can have the best ideas in the world in terms of finding the next big thing. But if you can't connect with the people who can actualize that by giving you the money to do so, then it's all pretty academic. Mm-hmm. So having that ability to span those worlds is vital. And I don't think I'm actually that good at it. I was just lucky in that the last thing we found, Nova, was so good that everybody wanted to talk, and the quality of the asset made everything else that much easier. I mean, I mentioned that we interviewed Malcolm, and his comment was exactly along the lines that no matter how ridiculous a meeting looks, take every meeting because you don't know what might come out of it. Yeah, you have to go and engage with everyone thinking that they're a viable option, and then see how it turns out. And I think one of his lessons was that he had to kind of train himself to do that, because not have perceptions about people and going into things. Oh yeah. I mean, there's I've been in a situation where a scruffy-looking guy sort of then buys $3 million worth of your shares.
Yeah, a real big hitter and a real loyal shareholder. And another occasion where you're in London in a flash office, a guy in a flash suit, and you're halfway through a presentation, and this is real. This is, and then he says, "So tell me, what's this thing called grade?" So this is also a point that, like when we talk about the investment community, we often refer to them as this homogeneous blob, but it's not. There's a lot of intricacies to that. There's obviously people that are well versed with the industry, people that are completely non-educated about the industry, and you have to kind of deal with all of this mob at the same time. Yeah, generalist investors don't understand mining. They certainly don't understand exploration. They're used to manufacturing and services and things like that, assuming that you do a certain thing and you get a certain result, not understanding that you don't necessarily get a result at all. So in some ways they're easier to sort of bring in, but they're much more management intensive when they're in, because you have to educate them and they don't understand. And often that's when the disappointment sets in and the realisation that it's different to what they thought. And then they exit and it affects your share price and everything flows on from that. Whereas, you get the resource specialists who at least get what you're doing. But then even within those guys, you've got the quantitative guys who just look at things mathematically. You've got the gut investors who go with a sense of their view on the management without really being able to rationalise it, who will come in for big licks.
Yep.
You've got highly technical guys who look at things very thoroughly and can be very right or can completely overanalyze things. You've got people who will, on one hand, be your best mate and be backing you in the market, but on the other hand, short selling you and making a fortune from that. So you don't actually know who you're talking to a lot of the time. You can work it out to a certain extent, but it's that is one of the real hard aspects of trying to be the person who's responsible for placing the shares of the company in the hands of the right people.
And I guess, the reason why I really wanted to have this discussion is I think there is this facade that a lot of people kind of get stuck in where they go, as long as you get a good technical idea, that's what you need for it to be a successful junior explorer. And I actually reckon that's perhaps one part of the equation, but realistically, all of these other things around it are actually far more important.
Yeah, it's, I say, and it sounds stupidly obvious, but doesn't happen a lot of the time, is you look at projects being developed and a lot of effort goes into mine design, metallurgy, marketing, infrastructure, on the assumption that the resource that has been given to them by the geologist is the resource. And there are resources and resources. And unless you can critically appraise whether that resource is real or just a house of cards, the rest can just be a house of cards and collapse. And it's the same with the approach to exploration, in that you can't explore without a good technical background in terms of geology, mineralisation, all the models, the technologies and so on. But what I found in the larger companies is, because that was people's sole role, that they were very obsessed with that and didn't get to see what else goes into it to actually make the difference. And I sort of sensed that, and moving down the food chain into smaller companies, my particular view is, you can't do without that geological expertise, but to a minor extent, plus or minus a couple of percent, everybody has that. And it's not ultimately that determines whether or not you find something. It's the other factors that add to that. And it's your ability to basically get enough money to chase those ideas, to maintain the support in the market to keep doing so. And, I left WMC, and when I was with Lion Ore before I found Thunderbox, I spent the best part of 2 years in a tent. And, people will ask me what led to the discovery of Thunderbox, and you can sort of talk about different technical processes and things like that. But I like to say ultimately what led to the discovery of Thunderbox was ultimately I was prepared to be in a tent for 2 years in the bush, whilst my previous peers were sort of sitting behind a desk with a flashy title and an expense account. And it's what people wanted, ultimately. Mm-hmm. I was prepared to forego that and just do that. And in a sense, that's what led to that outcome. It was the same with Nova. I was living in a tent out at the Fraser Range for a lot of the time prior to that. And a lot of people just weren't prepared by the time they were in the 40s to be getting their hands dirty and be sweating and swatting flies and things like that, and not have the sort of peer recognition or sort of place within an organisation that made them feel special.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, if you read anything by Adam Grant, a psychologist at Wharton, he has, the saying that we currently in our world don't have any shortage of good ideas. We have a shortage of people willing to do something with those ideas. And I think that's really what a lot of this comes down to. Yeah,
for sure. In a sense, and it sort of sounds silly, but the difference between succeeding and failing in exploration and the sort of stuff that I and my guys have done, ultimately the key differentiator is that we wanted it more. And, we were prepared to sacrifice more of other things to try and get to that point. And, it's like a 100-metre sprint in the Olympics in the final. They're all elite athletes. The one that wins by 100th of a second is the one that just wants it that little bit more to will themselves to do it.
Yeah, that's fine. So what advice would you have for someone that's thinking of going down the path of running their own company? What's some key characteristics, topics, things like that you've picked up along your way?
I think appraise yourself honestly and work out whether or not you have the sort of mental capacity to live with uncertainty and risk, and to live in a way where you get no thanks for anything. Now, if you feel you can do that, then that's the first step. If you can't, don't even try. I know people who have been directors and who, in an intellectual sense, have had all of the knowledge, understood all of the legal framework around that to be good directors, but haven't had that capacity to live with the risk and therefore have been unable to be effective in that role. So you need to do that. If your life circumstances are such that you've got nothing to lose, or you're prepared to put what you've got on the table and live with the consequences, that's fine too. But if you know you're in a position where personal circumstances are such that you don't want any risk of those being compromised, then don't.
Pretty good, I think. So if we wound the tape back and, you could talk to Mark Bennett 15 years ago, would you do something different? Or would you tell him there's something they should watch out for?
Probably not, because 15 years ago I hadn't experienced all of this. So
let's make it
I was
10.
only guessing.
Go join Apex. That would...
that I look back on that. That was Sirius wouldn't have happened without Apex. So
that's right. Yeah, that's fine.
But you don't know that at the time. You've just got to, I think, go with the flow. You reach these decision points in life, and if you're too afraid to do it, then you just won't. You've just got to go with the flow. Doesn't exactly sound like MBA material, that, but
I'm sure it's on the PowerPoint slide at some point somewhere. But I do like that, because it kind of says that the start doesn't necessarily justify the end. Yeah, there's a whole bunch of steps in the middle that you can still get to control along the way.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I used to ride a push bike. I still do, but quite a lot when I was younger. And I used to ride pretty long distances, like 100 miles at a time. And if I started out on one of those journeys thinking, shit, I've got 100 miles to do,
exactly,
I wouldn't have got on the bike. So I broke it down into smaller bits and just focused on the next little waypoint. And eventually I got there.
The dogged pursuit of short-term goals is much better than coming up with vast long-term goals, I think.
Yeah.
So this is a question we ask all of our guests. What's an idea that you think that needs to die in exploration? It can be a concept, a thing.
An idea.
What would you like to jettison out of exploration tomorrow?
Okay. This is a question without notice, so I'm going to
feel free to wing it.
I'm going to wing it, all right. Mineral systems, how about that?
Excellent.
Not that I don't, that's a fairly sort of all-encompassing comment, but it's one of these things that it's an idea that comes together that's very good, but then gets jumped on by lots of people, and it ends up losing its meaning and gets abused. Because, in the sense that, yeah, it's valid, it's good, it's great, but how do you get from that to actually finding something? That's the tricky bit.
I think like that concept of model thinking, I think as an industry, we're definitely very guilty of it at times.
Yeah, it's like strategy. You wouldn't want to start a battle without strategy, but you start a battle knowing that as soon as you start the battle, the strategy is going to be worthless and you have to change your tactics, but it doesn't mean you don't need a strategy.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. So conversely, what's an idea or a concept that you think we should maintain in exploration at all costs?
Simple, good old-fashioned boots on the ground. And I know a lot of rocks don't stick out the ground, but I think it's a dying skill. There's more and more focus on remote methods, including by remote I mean keyboards as well. and less on actually going there, looking and being able to say what rock it actually is, and how it's been altered and so on. And it comes down to the simple stuff a lot of the time. And a lot of people don't like me saying that because it's not what they do. But crude but effective, I think, is my preference.
That's you mentioned that people oppose this idea, but I think your comment, the way I would read it, is that you're talking about the tacit information that you can pick up by being boots on ground. You should ensure that that's still the valuable part of doing geology. And I think, people that oppose that view are not necessarily picking up that concept there. So I agree. The tacit information that you can pick up, you should try to maintain that as long as you can.
And that was one of the events that sort of helped me make up my mind about leaving WMC. It was way back in the beginnings of time when GIS systems were just starting to develop. And a lot of very smart people jumped on that particular bandwagon and spent a lot of time in their office basically trying to manipulate data to get an extra 2 or 3% of information from that data. But it never actually made a difference. Whereas by doing that, there was an opportunity cost. They weren't in the field where they could have got 10 or 20% more information out of the data available.
Mm-hmm.
So it was that mentality of trying to be clever, but not actually being prepared to go out and do it, that made me feel that this is the time to go. There's lots of opportunity for people who aren't trying to be clever and just want to do it.
Okay. So you thought that the company had a shift in what they found valuable at that point?
Yeah, look, I would go as far to say the clever thing about WMC was it recruited a lot of smart people. The not so clever thing about it was that those smart people, I think, spent more time nursing their egos and competing against one another for promotion and recognition within the company, for the furtherance of themselves, than actually working towards what the real objective was.
Mm-hmm.
And when you start getting that sort of fragmentation, you start getting a lot of dissipated energy. That's why ultimately when you're a small company, you're all in the same boat. You're reliant on yourselves, and if you can't function as a small little group, you're buggered.
And I think this may be something that we can explore, but I think the companies that are successful, the smaller companies that are successful, they are much better at being able to produce a collaborative product than necessarily an individually driven product.
Yep, it's one team that will all benefit from the outcome rather than a bunch of different teams of which one will be a winner and the rest will be losers.
Yeah, and you add in what people think is valuable, and then you have more dispersion about what people should be working on, and it compounds from that point on.
Yeah, and it flows into other things as well. The bigger the company, the bigger the threshold of target you need. So the greater the assumptions are used in what will be good enough or not. And it's always much easier to discount something rather than to not discount something. And with a small company, there's an imperative. Whatever you've got to make the most of it to survive. In some big companies, it's very easy to say this is not going to be big enough. And again, drawing on the WMC sort of time, and I think some of my ex-WMC colleagues will be smiling at this and some will be aghast, is that in my view, towards the end, there was almost this arrogant perception that if you weren't clever enough to be able to find an ore body with one drill hole, it wasn't worth finding. I did a study on 20 discoveries, and I think in probably 70% of circumstances, they only became big enough to satisfy the threshold criteria of the companies that had them, probably 3 or 4 years down the track, when the company had committed to developing a mine and they had their capital to protect and they needed to drill more to find more. And that's when they grew. They had no concept of how big or small they would be at the start. And if you go into something thinking, I want 5 million ounces of gold and you can only find one, then you might as well, turn the lights out.
I mean, I think the comment that you're making is like a classic problem of commitment at the start. Yeah. It's a lot easier to find ways to say no than to search for a way to say yes to doing something.
Yeah, absolutely. And, again, I remember an exploration manager coming out into the field with me to review one of my projects. and we were sitting in the Land Cruiser, and we arrived at the project and stopped. And he looked out the window and he looked around a bit, and then he just said, "Nah, carry on." It's pretty easy to say no and not have to go and walk for half a day. And interestingly, that particular project is now mine.
I think there's way too many stories of those around, I think. That's it, Mark. That's it for us. Thanks a lot for coming on our show again.
Oh, no problem. Pleasure.
And based on your performance today, you're definitely going to be on at some other point as well, if we can make it work. So no, thanks a lot for coming on. That was great.
Thanks, Ahmed.
Exploration Radio is brought to you by Steve and Ahmad. Our producer and all-round go-to guy is Dan Hershowitz. This podcast is recorded at the Perth Music House. If you'd like to know more about Exploration Radio, check us out on explorationradio.com. Or you can also find us on Twitter, Facebook, or LinkedIn. And as always, if you like this podcast, please review us on iTunes, Stitcher Radio, or wherever you get your podcast from. Until next time, let's keep exploring.